Dr. ROHINI BANNERJEE was born and raised in Dartmouth in Canada, obviously, daughter of immigrants from Himachal Pradesh, a beautiful state in India. She's an associate professor of French and Francophone studies in the Department of Modern Languages and Classics at St. Mary's University. ROHINI is a woman scholar of color who serves as a faculty member in the Asian Studies and Graduate Women and Gender Studies programs, and as graduate coordinator for the International Development Studies program. So ROHINI's primary research focuses on the literatures and cultures of the Francophone Indian Ocean, and she's currently president of the St. Mary's University Faculty Union and vice chair of Senate. Today, in a lecture entitled From Nosepins to Notebooks, Intersectionality in Higher Education, Professor Banerjee will talk about how we as teachers, scholars, respond to our university classrooms as spaces for fluid identity, among other issues related to a most interesting topic, which is how to bridge our common triangle that we all share here, which is our research, our teaching, and activism. So welcome again to a new edition of the association seminar. So good to see you again. It's an honor to have you, this time as a plenary speaker. So thanks for accepting actually our invitation. And thanks also for donating your honorarium to young scholars and of the association. We really appreciate that. So the floor is yours whenever you're ready.
Gracias. Thank you. Thank you. It's an honor to be with all of you. And in my heart, I'm in Spain. So I will begin sharing my screen with all of you. Hopefully this will work. Does everybody see that?
Sure.
Yep. Okay, great. And so before I begin, I want to recognize and pay respect to the First Peoples who on the traditional lands where we live and work. As all of you know, Canada is still a post-colonial state. We are a country of stolen land, essentially, and brought together by settlers and the descendants of stolen peoples. And it's very important that I acknowledge my presence on Mi'kma'ki, which is the ancestral lands of the Mi'kmaq Nation. So Nova Scotia is the province, but Mi'kmaq land is where I work. So I acknowledge my territory. Okay, let's see. So, you know, when Antonia asked me to be the plenary speaker, I was delighted. I was humbled. I was thinking, oh, she better give me some boundaries because if I don't have boundaries, I will go on and on as my three children hear me all the time into lecture mode, as they call it. But when she said, please talk about how we bring into practice as teachers, as scholars, what we do on the everyday, in the quotidien, in the everyday that we do, how we pursue our pedagogy, how we decide what kind of scholarship we do, and how we disseminate that scholarship, as well as the kind of service that we do either on campus or in the community. And all models of higher education differ in accordance to our country, our backgrounds, funding. All of us here sitting here know about funding and the lack of funding, particularly in this difficult time. But that shouldn't impede us in self-identification. And that's why a lot of my talk today is going to be very anecdotal and sharing with you some of the obstacles that I may have faced and how I worked around them. And how actually all of that has helped me become a better teacher and a better scholar. You know, the title was very deliberate. It was a bit of a word play with the idea of a notebook, signifying, of course, education, and the nose pin. being the aspect of intersectionality, a symbol of feminine self-expression. The fact that my parents, as Antonia has told you, are immigrants from Himachal Pradesh, and the acknowledgement of self-identification and self-expression. I really wanted to bring both of those bits together because being an educator with a nose pin in Canada has had its challenges. I like my notebooks to be unlined and without pagination. I like my nose pins to be sparkly and wide. I like all of those things. I like that because my nani, my maternal grandmother, who came from a Bedia tribe of Himachal Pradesh, which would have been named a scheduled group, an indigenous group under British rule. This same nani who would have used a thumbprint to sign British documents written in English, a language which she had no proficiency, she would never have ever have thunk that her granddaughter would be giving a talk on such a subject. This would not have been in her wildest dreams, that let alone she would have a granddaughter with higher education and would be able to talk openly and freely about some of the obstacles that we all face. So I picked this title on purpose to really bring together my passion of being myself and the power that I see in that, and how I notice students embracing the fullness of my identity, as well as my passion for education and the dissemination of my scholarship. And so I want to sort of bring into play this idea of self-identification. And this is something that perhaps in North American contexts is coming, and definitely in the US, is something that we see more and more in higher ed. You know, I remember my very first time getting a speeding ticket in the United States, by a very large constable with his very big gun, very close by his belt, and being very conscious of the fact that I was in South Carolina and that I looked the way that I did, and I didn't fit into the script of a Black woman, a Black American woman. The officer didn't really know how to identify me, and he didn't actually ask me my identification. He just marked on my ticket, other. So he decided that I was other. And I smiled and did some tears, told him I was from Canada and that I was a lost graduate student going to a conference in North Carolina and didn't realize that miles and kilometers were not the same. And he tore up the receipt, the ticket, and let it be. But what really shocked me in my early 20s was really how the fact that he had decided who I was. He had decided that I was other and put that into the database, you know, that he was collecting. And this is something that, you know, in the US, as I said before, has been quite normalized. But what are we doing in Canada? And really my context is going to be Canadian for all of you, because that is the higher education system that I know the best. And so I just wanted to outline some of the things that I do. And as you can see, I have tentacles all over the place. I'm like the goddess Natarajan. This is what I tell my children. You know, I'm the Natarajan goddess with my thali is very full. I mean, I've got dal and chutney, and I've got lamb gosht and achar and biryani and aloo gobi. I've got the whole thing, veg and non-veg, spicy and sweet. And I get pushed back. I get pushed back on a lot of it. And I had to push hard to join a lot of these different groups. And why am I telling you this? I'm telling you this because this is part of my self-identification. And this is what I do for students immediately when I come to the classroom. I let them know what they've signed up for. They haven't just signed up for a Banerjee course who's been teaching for 13 years at St. Mary's. No, I'm not that. I'm actually a graduate coordinator for MA and PhD students. I work in Asian studies. Ironically, Asian studies is what brought me to Spain. Asian studies is what got me to Cordoba in 2006. I remember wearing a pink sari and very big jumkas, pumping petrol outside of the Universidad de Cordoba, where a member of the local Roma community approached me. I think really just wanted to chat and figure out who I was. And my very, very broken Spanish, Antonia knows my Spanish, how good it is. I tried to explain, mis padres son de la India. pero soy directamente de la Canadá. Y también soy una profesora de francés. What is going on? Who is this woman? Why is she wearing a sari? And why is she a French professor? And my madrilena, Spanish mother-in-law with her very heavy Castellano accent kept giving me googly eyes. Get in the vehicle, get in the vehicle. What are you doing? Who are you talking to? What are you doing? Why are you causing such a ruckus? Yes, my mother-in-law is from Spain. And so it has been it was a very interesting experience for me, because it was in that moment, in that essence of multiplicity, of intersectionality, actually pumping petrol in Cordoba with a sari on, speaking broken Spanish to a Roma woman, that I really thought about who I was. Again, going back to that US police officer who decided who I was. You know, I'm a Canadian woman of Punjabi Christian immigrants, despite the Banerjee name, despite the Brahmin Bengali name. I don't speak Bengali. I realize that I am very multifunctional, multi-layered, and I thrive on the unpredictability of my work, of my day, of the students that I might encounter, by the people I might meet at the petrol station. This is actually who I am. And you know, I've been told that, why are you in women and gender studies? Is it because you're a woman? Why are you doing intercultural studies? Why are you doing peace and conflict studies? You know, maybe you should choose something and be really good at it. Expert, specialize, focus. But for whom am I doing that? Is it to make others in higher ed more comfortable, so I can have a fixed appointment in a particular department with certain expectations and limitations, so I can stay in my lane? I've had people come up to me, you know, in the parking lot as I'm off to collect my children from school. Usually they're cis white men who accost me in the parking lot as I'm trying to get into my vehicle and leave. Why are you on every committee? Why do I see this name Banerjee everywhere I go? And so this questioning, this idea of, maybe am I not in a way decolonizing the very system into which I desperately wanted to fit? And in turn, am I also decolonizing the classroom, allowing students to be themselves, all Natarajan arms out and about? If they could see me, if my students could see me loving all that I do and actually not dislike myself, perhaps they will have the strength to do the same. And so I needed to belong. And one of the ways that I remind students, you know, on the very first day of classes, as all of you have experienced, those of us who teach in the university or college system, it's not an easy day, the very first day. And at least with us, you know, we have to give out our course syllabus, and we have to give them the expectations and when are the assignments and how much to read. But I really try and get them to know who I am. And I make it very clear that I'm a daughter of immigrants of lower middle class, that, you know, my matrilineal line is Indigenous, something that hasn't really been something of great pride for my mother for a long time. She really didn't like to talk about that, the fact that she came from what is known as a Scheduled tribe, and that she married, you know, a fair-skinned Banerjee or Bandhapadai, and really became, in a way, Desi washed when she became an immigrant to Canada, and her indigeneity was removed as part of her identity. I went to Catholic school, independent school, a private school, which would have cost a lot of money in the 80s for immigrant parents. I was on financial aid. I was an Anglican in a Catholic school with brown skin. And all of that, along with these three little bambinos, these niños that I have, it's all part of how I approach students in really being quite clear and authentic of all of the parts that I am. I don't like the term near native or native speaker, because I'm a learned speaker. I did not exit my mother's body speaking French. This was not, my parents still don't even know how to say bonjour. This is not something that I would have heard at home. There was no language of French at home. And so being a learned speaker for a long time felt like an obstacle, felt like I had to always step up and work a bit harder, particularly because it's a Eurocentric language. It's a language from Europe, but actually it's more of a superpower. I'm living proof that one can study and learn and become a student as a career. Essentially, I've chosen to be a student for the rest of my life. And I tell students, especially when I have students from France or from Quebec, who are francophones, and I'll always say, je suis francophone de formation. I'm a learned speaker and I continue to learn with you. Being a kid of immigrants gives me a certain perspective. I come from, post-settler. I acknowledge that I am on Indigenous land. And that's how I move forward when I identify myself as a Canadian who is a child of immigrants. And I think that's really important because I want, if someone asks me, and they do very often, where I come from, where do I really come from? I remind everyone that I encounter in Canada that all of us are treaty people, and all of us are peoples who have come here on treaty land. I have accepted and celebrated the fact that I will never be a cis white male. And I think I wanted to be a white woman for a long time with blue eyes and perhaps be named Jennifer. I wanted to do that because it would have been easier on some aspects. But when I broke into academia, I wanted to be Mark or Lucas or Juan. That would have been easier and would have been better. But I like makeup and I like jewelry and I like handsome straight men and I like philosophy and literature and feminism and French fries and aloo gobi. I love all of it. And I became a union leader. And I've been asked, well, maybe perhaps you're too maternal to be doing union work. That's tough. That's tough work. How can you handle it? I purposefully put my name forward for Senate and was asked to become vice chair, which allows me to do more governance, more decision-making when it comes to academic regulations. And I'm seeing students comment on the fact that I'm vice chair. I'm asked then to do more governance type of training for students themselves, and particularly for racialized students. I'm asked how I balance life and work, and I simply say, I do not. It's a flow, like my monthly cycle in a way. It ebbs and flows, hormones up and down. The to-do list is up and down. Kids and family are joys and burdens, flows and crashes. And the waves that swallow me whole, sometimes I have to come up for air and find a life jacket and float for a little while. So perhaps by being open with students about the struggles, about the limitations of my day, of the expectations I have of them and they of me, by being as authentic and honest of my true self, I'm in fact creating an environment that is promoting diversity, equity, and inclusion. So being normal then really is about being yourself. So I've put here sort of the generic words that many of us might have seen, and particularly in North America, when we're talking about moving forward, how our classrooms look. Most of our classrooms, as many of you know, in Canada are from international. We have many, many international students. St. Mary's likes to say that we have 33% of our students are international, which has been devastating during this time of COVID, as you can understand. What I worry about, particularly as somebody who is a union leader, is the fact that our professorate does not reflect the reality of our classrooms. And this is where we're working towards creating a professorate, a senior management that is more reflective of the times. So the question is, what is equity, diversity, and inclusion, and why is that important in the classroom and in our scholarship? And as Antonia has alluded to, activism. Right. And I feel like often, particularly when I'm in union related work, I'm not activist enough. I've been told this. I've been told this particularly by racialized professors, by professors of color who've said to me, well, you just seem, you're not loud enough. You're not protesting enough. And that idea of enough, right? That has been subjective, depending on who is telling me what I am and what I'm not, right? So if it's a cis white male, well, you're not male enough, you're not aggressive enough, you're not pushing enough. from a woman's perspective, it might be that I'm too pushy or too aggressive. And from people of Black, Indigenous, or people of color, professors often will push on me and say that I'm not activist enough. And so there's that sense of, how am I going to be my authentic self and be truly the teacher and scholar that I want to be? And so what I've written here are just very simple things that we would actually tell our children. Be respectful of others by listening actively and not interrupting. I've realized I don't do this very well. I've realized I'm not a very good listener. And I need to learn to listen. I need to refrain from speaking. I need to not interrupt. This is a very basic thing. And most of us would think that we all do it anyways, but you'd be surprised to know how much we don't listen. Be mindful that everyone be given an opportunity to speak. And I do this in the classroom particularly when I have a student, for example, in a French language class, who might have not only French as their second language, but English as their second language. And their first language might be, let's say, Mandarin, let's say Russian, or we might have someone from South America who might be speaking either Spanish or another indigenous language. And French is just another proponent to stress and distress. So I really try to make an opportunity to have that person speak. And sometimes it's very deliberate. I also try and be mindful of how many times women are answering a question versus men. And most of us who are in humanities and in languages, at least in Canada, you'll see that there's predominantly more women in the classroom. And so there's often, I often try and call on men to engage in conversations that may be slightly uncomfortable for them, certainly because the demographic is such that women are often answering the questions. And so I try to get the men to speak a bit more. When challenging or disagreeing with ideas expressed by other participants or by myself, do so carefully and refrain from personal attacks. And you would say, oh, of course, I'm not going to personally attack a student. But you'd be surprised how much bias we have. And I'm going to talk about that in a little bit, about a lot of the bias that we actually hold on to without really realizing it. So when I ever talk about the word equity, my 7-year-old Subin always says to me, Mommy, equity is another word for money. And I always laugh because he's right. Equity is another word for money. So maybe is equity also an exchange or a currency of some sort? Are we building equity in our everyday lives in a way that is similar to a business model? So what I say is that we need to acknowledge the barriers and the bridges in everyday scenarios where diversity, equity, and inclusion are at play. And all of these pieces of the puzzle, that's a lot. That's a lot of things going on. And particularly in Canada and the Canadian context, all of these things pop up all the time. And we need to be hyper aware of that. And that really takes intercultural competence, right? It takes emotional intelligence. And many of us have PhDs and we think we're really good at this, but we're not. We still need a lot of work when it comes to hearing perspective, acknowledging race, looking at skill sets. I mean, I myself have to rework lectures, realizing that some students are visual learners. Some students are auditive learners. Some students need me to redo my PowerPoint using pen and paper. Some of my mature students, so when it comes to age, are learning at a different rate. How am I going to adjust to all of these bits when I teach and prepare my courses? And we have to come up with a plan, and in each course is different, and every time, and the material that we're discussing is different. And so we need to learn to build those allies and encourage mobilization of our network. And so I always give the example, for example, when I'm teaching French poetry and 17th century French poetry, okay? And the same course is given by my colleague Jean-Jacques, who's an awesome guy, who's born in France, whose accent is like butter. Okay, you just want to spread his French all over your toast. He's just beautiful French. And I tell students, I say, you can go and take a class with Monsieur Jean-Jacques, and you will get a certain perspective of 17th century poetry. But if you take it with me, you'll get a different perspective. And I'm very, very clear about that. Me teaching Montesquieu, me teaching Descartes, okay, is going to have, it's going to be delivered in a different method, in a different way than Jean-Jacques. And students could argue and say, well, why is your course different if the material is the same? But that's because the medium is the message, okay? And that's Marshall McLuhan, the great semiotic linguist from Canada, who talks about the fact that, you know, the person delivering the message is part of the message. The medium is the message. And so I tell students, you know, you need to see the fact that I have dark skin and that I am a kid of immigrants and that I am a learned speaker. And so my approaches to the material will be different than Jean-Jacques, who was born in France. The truth is, and this is the quote that I have, if they don't see color, they don't see you. And when you surround yourself with people who refuse to see you, you become accustomed to not seeing yourself. And how can I be the best teacher if I don't acknowledge my own self? And, you know, we all ask this question about what is the difference between equity and equality, that everyone should be treated the same. And we should, I mean, I had this argument with someone the other day about Vice President Kamala Harris and the fact that, you know, well, we shouldn't be giving her all of this praise because she's a woman and a woman of color. And I just decided to end the conversation prematurely and said what I needed to say and moved on. But the fact that equity and equality are not the same, and really recognizing differences and ensuring that everyone has equal outcomes is not the same as equality. And this can be problematic in a higher ed situation. You know, I have to make sure that I'm also treating myself fairly. I have to adjust my curriculum, my approaches to curriculum. I have to be me, which in turn allows students to be themselves. And I have not really realized that impact until very recently, when students will call upon me, you know, 10 years after they've graduated and say, oh, would you like to go grab a coffee or have a martini? And I think, wow, why do they want to see me in public? Why do they want to talk to me? And a lot of them have become teachers. A lot of them are working in as public servants, working for the government, perhaps in the Ministry of Education and in policy work. And they say, I never really understood that I had so many layers to myself. And I appreciate the fact that you adjusted curriculum based on yourself. And I think a lot of the time we have learning outcomes, right? We're told by our heads of our departments, students, by the time they finish this course, will have understood the following concepts. I'm certainly not pulling away from those learning outcomes, but I'm ensuring that as we approach those learning outcomes and as we approach the material, that I'm doing it in a way that shows the best of me as well, which then allows students to be themselves. You know, and I sometimes use this example to help students understand and colleagues understand, you know, everyone has to use the stairs to enter the building. And I will have to say, when I was in Spain, this was always very challenging. I always thought, how do people with wheelchairs access Madrid? It's very challenging. And, you know, this idea that, well, if you don't have stairs and you have to use a ramp, you're making it easier for someone else. And that's not fair to everyone else. But really, it's about making sure that people are not prevented from having access to something, right? So this is very clearly a problem for this person in this chair. This person is not going to be able to enter the building. This is very clear, and we can see that. So we have to provide a special accommodation. And there will be lots of people who will say, well, why do we have to do that? Maybe perhaps this person can go to a different restaurant. You know, maybe they can't enter the building. And, you know, it is so vital as teachers that we realize that we are often putting stairs in front of wheelchairs without us knowing. You know, again, this is sort of back to that original point that, you know, when I teach the same material as Jean-Jacques, I have to bring in my lived experience, that when I am speaking to students about something, I do bring in the fact that I'm POC and that I'm a learned speaker, and that professor and students can be authentic. You know, on my course outline, I make it very clear that I will receive your emails, but I will not respond to them after a certain period of time. Now, we all know this is untrue. Okay, many of us are looking at emails on our phone at dodgy hours when really we should not be doing this, and telling our children not to be using screens. And all of us here are doing exactly the opposite of what we tell our family members not to do. However, I want students to know that I have limitations on my workday. And part of it is part of my union brain that works, but part of it is I want them to see that there are limitations that I've placed on myself, and that being a scholar is still a viable job for many of our students. A lot of students are really worried. They don't want to be professors. They're looking at that job and thinking, I don't want to be her. That's an awful job. She's working constantly. She's checking emails at 11 o'clock at night. And so you want to make sure that you're modeling behavior and approaches to teaching and learning in ways that are functional and predictable and healthy. And so I tell students, I won't check my email in the evening. So you can send me emails and emails and emails saying that, did you check my email? But I will not respond to you. Now, of course, the next morning, it's sometimes a tornado, but we deal with it. So moving along, I'm just aware of our time. We're already at past. Equity is equity the same as diversity and inclusion? And so we talk about the fact that diversity is an outcome, right? So diversity is the representativeness and the presence of difference. And the question is, what is difference? And I think it's really important that, I can lay out all these differences. This is what differences is. But what's important to remember is that difference is not just about revolving around heteronormative whiteness. A lot of the time, there's this sense that whiteness, heteronormative whiteness, is the main sun, and everything, everything revolves around it. And there are differences in approaches. And these are some of the questions that I've had, approached to me. How can people take you seriously when you have long hair and wear eyeshadow? I mean, this is something that's actually been said to me directly to my face. I've asked at department meetings, and I know Spanish is a gendered language, but in Canada, we can choose, and we don't have to say the word guys. And I've asked people, please do not use that term. And my answer often is, well, just relax, don't worry about it. I remember when I had my third pregnancy, which was a surprise baby, I literally had a professor, a male professor, point to my belly and ask me how I was going to get tenure and promotion with this new baby coming along. How is this going to affect my dossier? So this is the kind of thing that I think often we have these micro and macro aggressions, whether we realize them or not, and really understanding them and being out about them and being open about them is going to help our students as well, so that they can also see that these experiences are going to happen to them. And I think it's really important, all of us as teachers, as scholars, and even though we may not be on campus in the same way as we have been in before, I think it's really important to just really acknowledge the backgrounds that we see. And I acknowledge the fact that perhaps having brown skin does not absolve me from racism. Absolutely not. The colorism and shadism that is inherently embedded in South Asian culture, as all of us here know, is problematic and disturbing. And so I need to be very careful of how I look at all of these aspects here. How am I approaching somebody who might be queer or trans? Maybe somebody who comes from a low socioeconomic background and doesn't have a lot of education and wants to pursue university education. How do I handle somebody whose religious beliefs differ from mine? This is a constant hard work that's ahead of us. I try to get students to think about perspective taking. I teach an intercultural studies class where I get them to really literally walk in someone else's shoes. I ask them to bring a pair of shoes that is not their own, from home, from a friend. And I ask them to walk in those shoes and discuss what it might feel like. I've had some men try to put on my shoes. That's been also very interesting. But this idea of empathy and building inclusive cultures, I try to do exercises in the class that get them to think literally, physically like someone else. And so one of the other things I do is I get students to kind of come up with a fantasy name. And this has always been an interesting thing because Rohini is not a very common name in my part of the world. And so often when I'm ordering a coffee from Starbucks, I put on a different name, and I have then the barista who looks at me and says, "You're not Tina Turner." And I say, I know, but for now I am. Just let me have my fantasy. Would you like to have my real name? No, let's just go with the fun name for now. And I ask students to do the same thing. And I ask them to think and live and breathe as someone different from themselves, and talk about some of the challenges that they might face being from that background. What's very interesting is students are often moved by the situation. They realize their own bias, and there's many different types of exercises that we do to get them to acknowledge their implicit bias. We know that there's all kinds of sort of psychology tests that we do, and I'm not a psychology professor, so I'm really working on based on lived experience, and it's been a great exercise in many of my classes. Inclusion is that sort of last bit of diversity and equity, and it's really ensuring that everyone is feeling valued and welcome, and that is challenging, and that's a challenging aspect of higher ed, because you can really make everything perfect. Okay, you can feel like, all right, I'm well versed, I'm really smart, I'm making sure that I understand all of the aspects of my classroom. I'm putting all of my work online. I'm making things easier for people who have any accessibility issues. But how do we make people feel welcome and valued? And, I've had this experience in a boardroom. I sit on a number of boards. I do a lot of governance work. And, that diverse space doesn't always mean that those who are marginalized identities are welcomed. I don't want to be the token brown woman. However, often I am. And so I have to see myself as Oprah Winfrey talks about, and there is a video that I want to show you, but I don't know if I have enough time. I do want to have time for questions. This notion of, every time she walks into a boardroom, she talks about the fact that she brings all of her ancestors with her. And that, I do the same. I often find myself in a situation where, well, Rohini, we really want to hear your perspective. Your lived experience. And so I have to think about my two grandmothers who would never have had that opportunity to talk about what their lives were like, particularly my dadi, who came from Lahore pre-partition, brought to India to marry a man several years older than her, and then suddenly found out her country had become Pakistan. So, I think about those women, I think about those grandmothers, and I think, okay, every time I walk into a space that feels uncomfortable, that feels like I don't belong, I don't fit in, I have to find a way to belong, right? And that's why I like saris, of course, because saris, you never have to fit into a sari. You belong in the sari wraps around you. This is what I always tell students. Another thing about, is how do we encourage mothers? And this is a very particular, I have some particular interest in this, having 3 children myself, and having seen junior faculty really struggle with working during parental leaves, and noticing that projects seem to disappear when they have a baby. And why is that? And how do we get the women to stay at the table? Well, let them email when they can. We had a chastising email by one of our senior management who had said to us, do not email after 4:30. Well, sometimes mothers can only email after 4:30. That is just the way it is. And so allowing some flexibility, having meetings at different times of the week, just generally being more flexible. And I think North America is doing better at this, but there is still a lot of stigma. I remember, again, with my 3rd baby, who was a surprise, a lot of people had come up to me and said, you should have waited. You should have waited. Why did you have another child? Why would you want 3? It's amazing what people will say to you and have the audacity to tell you. And I always wonder, if I was a man, would that ever happen? This is one of the, bits that I wanted to talk about. I was on a hiring committee while I was on sabbatical. And I was in a different city. I had left campus. I left Halifax. And I wanted to make sure that I was on the committee. And this was because I had pushed and pushed and pushed for an African literature specialist. And I really was pushing that this person have lived experience. What was really important for me is that and this is before Zoom, this is when we were still using Skype, I wanted my interview, I wanted to be part of the interview, and I wanted my face to be visible. And my, colleagues are looked at me, well, they'll know that you're not white by your name. And I said, that's not good enough. I have been in interviews where I walk in and the entire room are white people. And it is intimidating. I don't feel like I I'm comfortable and I actually can't be my full self. And I want the people that are coming in for the interview to see somebody who has brown skin and maybe perhaps feel more comfortable being themselves. This is an inclusive practice. I had to push for it, but I wanted them to know who was interviewing them and what they look like and why that was important. And I finally got what I wanted and was allowed to be Skyped in. So I'm just looking at the time. I'm just going to skip a couple of these things and just sort of get into my last 10 steps. One of them is really acknowledging difference. And I know all of us are thinking, of course I know acknowledge difference, but really acknowledging differences, seeing differences and celebrating differences. Acknowledging that it's not about fitting in. Asking colleagues, any of your union leadership, anybody around you that you feel like has a little bit more experience for guidance. And if you don't, then become that leader yourself. And I know that sounds really easy to say, but there are ways that that can be done. There are ways that we can find for yourself to kind of get into that leadership position. Thinking about your own bias, increasing your immediate circle. And that's not always easy. I recently joined an migrant association here in Halifax, and I'm doing an art and storytelling project for 6 weeks. So there's an art aspect, and then for an hour with children, and then the children go and the mothers stay behind, and I do a storytelling creative workshop with them. And our subject is names, our first names, and how often as immigrants or migrants, our names change. And so that has been something that's increased my circle a little bit. I'm not getting paid. It's all volunteer. This is not some glorious thing that I'm going to put on my CV and say, wow, she's doing all this community work, but I'm actually getting to meet other women. And perhaps in those contacts and in those rencontres, I might be able to help some other women find other leadership opportunities for them. And so that's what I'm really hoping comes out of it. Learn a language, and many of you are already multilingual in Europe. In Canada, this is a big problem. So I can't, I'm speaking to the wrong audience when I talk about learning a language, but particularly in Canada, we really are uncomfortable with learning languages. And so pushing students to go and do more languages is important. Again, walking in the shoes of others, trying to have some empathy. Thinking about Maya Angelou, who talks about knowing better, doing better. And so just learn to know better. And how do you know better? You keep learning and you keep reading and you keep asking questions and you continue to have that student mindset. And I think that's really important for students to see that professors are essentially students. And I always say, have a pair of shades handy, because sometimes people can't handle all of the light that comes out of you. And I'm learning over and over again to pass along a pair of sunglasses to somebody who can't handle it. So, this is my masala dabba. This is what I always say, that, I could be like a thali with all kinds of things going on, but, a Desi feminist has all of these things. Okay. And, I often think that when I approach students and students sort of look at all the perspectives that I might be able to bring forth in my personality, in my approach to teaching, to my approach to scholarship, the fact that I'm, here with all of you, with this Spanish association, kind of reinforces the notion that being yourself is really the best choice. And if we can reinforce that with our students, the activism will come out of that automatically. The students will feel more and more confident of being themselves, and you'll actually get more out of them. The more that they can feel they can be themselves, the better it is for everybody. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to your comments and questions.